Hello again, I am Blunty. What you're seeing is native gameplay from the Monster Hunter Rise demo on Nintendo Switch side by side with real-time graphics enhancement processing done with a device called the Mclassic. I'll show you some other games too, but this video lies in the context of some Monster Hunter Rise stuff I talked about recently, so we'll start there. As for the Mclassic, some of you retro gaming loving peeps may already be quite familiar with it. The rest of you, I'll break down what it is, what it does, and why it does it in just a moment. But first, we need some context for why. About 3 weeks ago, I published a video about Monster Hunter fandom having internal shitfits about the upcoming release of Monster Hunter Rise, the Nintendo Switch exclusive title due for release in about 6 weeks from now. The arguments being battered to and fro center around two main issues. A lot of other smaller issues, but two main issues. One is changes to game mechanics and features. Some see these as natural evolutions for the game. Some see them as a dumbing down of the notoriously challenging game for the baby noobs. I'm not going to get into that. I'm not deeply enough steeped in Monster Hunter experience to have a thick ground to stand on that argument, except to say I adored how dynamic and reactive the fights in the demo of Rise feel. But if you do have opinions on that, well, that's what the comment section is for. Also, take a swipe at the sub button, the bell, and the thumb buttons on your way if you'd like to show a little appreciation here for the work I put into this video. No, the argument I'm talking about today and the argument I addressed in my original video centered around the issue of graphics. Naturally, as a Nintendo Switch title, it's a significant downgrade from the next most recent Monster Hunter game, Monster Hunter World, and its expansion, Iceborne, which live on now last-gen consoles, but have performance patches for next-gen consoles, or current-gen consoles, I guess we should start calling them, and of course, PC. And on those current-gen consoles, and especially on PC, it is a richly detailed game with lush environments and highly detailed monsters and armor sets, and in the case of new-gen consoles and PC, can be played at 4K 60 FPS, and I've recently been trying again myself after bouncing off it at PC launch a few years back, but this time around I'm playing on PS5, and I'm very much enjoying it. Monster Hunter Rise, however, is significantly more simplistic in its presentation. Obviously, it has to be. It's a Nintendo Switch game, but especially so in the environments, saving as much graphical power as possible to keep the monsters' detail and complexity up, and of course the most important part of grinding loot chase games, the endgame fashion run for armor and weapons. And despite Monster Hunter World in fact being an outlier in the series, it's a freak, a rare deviant, a variation of Monster Hunter. See, the issue is, for most of Monster Hunter's 17-year existence, it has had comparatively simplistic graphics. Its most popular titles were, in fact, all on handheld versions, where low-res, low-poly, muddy textures were the simple fact of life. But Monster Hunter World, a very rare example of modern Monster Hunter game, not just for its unusually detailed graphical presentation and fidelity, but also for the fact it was on PC at all, it is most Monster Hunter players' first experience with it. You see, Monster Hunter World sold many millions more copies than the next best-selling version of the game on a handheld. And that means most of Monster Hunter's existing player base will be using Monster Hunter World as their benchmark, while a comparatively smaller amount of the current fandom have their roots back further in early games, and their issues with the graphics on the Switch seem lesser. But for the World players, it's the only comparison point they have. It's the only Monster Hunter they're familiar with, so of course they're going to measure the Switch version via World's standards. And by that measure, they are, understandably perhaps, very upset about the seeming massive drop in graphics. Or maybe they're just using that argument as an excuse to complain that it's system exclusive to the Switch, and they feel like that's holding it back somehow. And they'd be happier if it wasn't system exclusive, which is all fair enough to want to express. It's not the first time we've had games do this kind of stuff to us. But perhaps not in as juvenile and petty ways as some of the Monster Hunter fandom are choosing to express it. But you know, certain types of gamers got a gamer, if you buffer my input here. My own opinion about the graphics, despite my own first and to date only proper experience with the series being World, as many others is, as we just talked about, I think it's fine. The graphics are certainly more than sufficient to serve the gameplay, and in the heat of a fight, I'm really not so worried about the muddy texture of a rock face over there, or the jagged edges of a leaf over there. I did think, though, that the graphics might benefit from a bit of extra contrast and anti-aliasing. And so in that original video, that's exactly what I did. I ran a sophisticated upscaler in DaVinci Resolve, which uses machine learning algorithms to scale it up to 4K, and that took a very long time to do. It's very computationally intensive. No way you could do that in real time properly, even on my very powerful PC. But I also did some color corrections to it. I did go a bit overboard with the saturation and contrast just to drive the point home a little bit and make it more dramatic a difference when I was demonstrating it, but all in all, I did think it looked noticeably better with richer colors and deeper shadows, with or without the AI upscaling to 4K. And all of that reminded me of a device I've been aware of for a few years now, but had never had any reason to check out, which brings us back to the Mclassic. Marketed as a console graphics processor, it's basically a near real-time video filter, specifically set up for gaming needs. Marcel, the company who make it, also have a similar device built right into an HDMI cable designed to upscale movies and TV in real time. That device is not appropriate for gaming though, because it doesn't do anything but 30 FPS. The Mclassic was first envisioned as a way to help upscale and clean up graphics from retro games in particular, much to the chagrin of some purists which hated the idea of fiddling with the original graphics. But with the Nintendo Switch in particular, it has perhaps found a more modern use, a more practical use, a more widespread use. And with Monster Hunter Rise, I finally had a relevant excuse to snatch one up myself and give it a go. Because it basically does what I was trying to demonstrate in my original video. Now, I don't really care about the upscaling, which is quite limited and basic anyway, and heavily dependent on source resolution and frame rate to do anything especially useful, but the two things this device does do are very similar to the things I did in my own footage in that first video on the subject. Firstly, it runs an anti-aliasing filter, one specifically tuned for games, attempting to smooth out the jaggies without making every edge a muddy blur. And to this purpose, it actually succeeds reasonably well. Very well, in fact, noticeably reducing a lot of the stair-stepping while avoiding turning the whole image to mush, as many basic anti-aliasing techniques can and will do. After that, some sharpening to bring back some perceived detail. It seems to be a mild sharpening filter with the help of some boost to contrast and saturation. Again, nearly exactly what I was trying to do with my color correction in my video editor. And the result is similar too. You do lose some detail in the shadows for the sake of bolder contrast, but overall, the image I think does look cleaner, punchier, sharper. Marcel claimed the Mclassic can do all of this with no lag, which is idiotic. You're digitally post-processing a video feed, frame by frame, pixel by pixel, on a little chip inside the device. It is simply against the laws of physics to claim you can do this instantaneously and transparently with exactly zero lag. It's just literally impossible. But they are doing this processing at the equivalent of 120 frames per second, so in effect, it doesn't feel like there's any lag. What time it does take to process a whole frame of video is fast enough that for a 30 and even 60 FPS game, unless you have sophisticated measuring equipment, you really couldn't demonstrate the fractional lag there is, much less feel it when you're gaming. And to be fair, outside the wording of this, they are pretty honest with this, because even in their own test up on their own website, they show there is some lag, but it's in the order of a couple of decimals of a millisecond. So, while it can't possibly be no lag, it's just me being pedantic, as I'm wont to do. No perceptible lag is the more honest but less advertisingly flashy way to say it. The device is also idiotically easy to use. There's no accompanying software, you don't have to worry about anything at all. It literally just sits in line to your existing HDMI cable, in on one end, out on the other. It even comes with a little extension cable, seemingly expressly for the Nintendo Switch, as its own bulk wouldn't allow it a direct connection to the dock. You also don't need to unhook it whenever you don't want or need it for a particular game. It has a switch to turn all the effects off and just let the native signal pass right through. So, for the cost of 100 American-style smackaroonies, you can have one. And I think I like it. I'm impressed by the lack of perceived lag. I'm impressed that they clearly very deliberately chose relatively mild settings for their various filters so as not to overwhelm the natural look of the game, only trying to clean it up a little bit and give it a gentle nudge, noticeable enough to be worth it for many games, but without Instagram filtering the bejeebus out of it, ruining any of the native charm the developers intended for their art style. I'm genuinely impressed and a little bit surprised by their restraint on this. It could have been very easy to go way too far to make it a very stark difference. So yeah, I will be leaving it hooked up to my Switch for the time being, and absolutely trying it out when Monster Hunter Rise releases. If the difference is significant to what I've been showing here, I'll probably even do a follow-up video. But I'm still hoping for a render resolution boost and perhaps some image saturation and contrast adjustments and boosting internal to the final version of the game when it releases. Because remember, this demo, published months before release, isn't necessarily fully representative of the performance or look of the finalized code because it isn't the finalized code. It's a demo released a couple of months ahead. They are literally still working on it as I say these words. But the Mclassic is still an interesting tool to have at my disposal for the likes of the Switch. I'll keep it handy for when I bust out the Wii and Wii U again too, I think. If you missed the video I did last year on the HDMI output converters for those, I'll link those videos in the down below for you. Meanwhile, thank you very much for watching. Hope you found this interesting, useful, informative, or just entertaining. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. And thank you as always to the patrons scrolling up above there. Your above and beyond support is deeply meaningful to me. Thank you ever so much for that. I am Blunty. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time.